So this whole idea of why I'm doing this, you have to understand why this is important to me. To understand that, you need to go look at my story of what happened when I first went to London back in 1992 with my wife, Judy. I started going down to Speaker's Corner because that is the place where you learn what the Muslims are saying and you learn how to engage them and you hear what their best material is, and you are then able to come up with rebuttals to that. In 1992, I started going down there, and I realized that all I had was apologetics. I didn't really have any polemics. And for those of you who don't know what I mean by polemics, it's going on the offense. Apologetics would be defense, polemics would be offense. So I was there to confront Islam. Speaker's Corner in London, there at Hyde Park, is the only place left in the world where you can do that publicly. You're not permitted to do this in any other country, in any other place, not even in Britain, except for Speaker's Corner there in London. So it's a perfect venue for just doing that. And so I began my polemics by the bitsomp. What we mean by this, by the seat of my pants, or as we say in Britain, by the seat of our trousers, because there's just no other book, there's no other course, there's no other people that teach it. So we had to learn it by really off the cuff. In 1994, then, I took a course from Dr. Gerald Hawting, who you can see pictured there at the School of Oriental and African Studies, on the origins of Islam. And he opened up an entire new area of that I had never heard about. Much of that I'm going to be introducing today. And this began for me, my discovery of the whole historical critique of Islam. Now, look at the date, 1994. We're talking about 30 years ago. So I've been working on this for 30 years. This is not new for me. It'll be new for you, but it's not new for me and a few others, including especially the academia there in United Kingdom. In 1995, I then was asked by Muslims to debate Dr. Jamal Badawi on the Quran at Cambridge University. And now I'd never done any debates before, so this is my first debate. And I gave 10 historical challenges at that debate. He could not respond to one of them. And I realized that this is amazing because the best that they had in the world at that time on the Quran, if he had done 300 videos on the Quran and he could not respond to one of these challenges, I realized we had material that the Muslims would not be able to handle. Unfortunately, this was not agreed by most people, most of the church there in England. Colin Chapman, a good friend of mine, asked me to do a debate about this material. And so we had a debate in 1997 at Sully Oaks College in Birmingham, only with Christian academics and Christian missionaries were permitted to come to that debate. So it was an in-house debate. We had 50 in there at Sully Oaks College in 1997, and I debated Dr. David Marshall. Yes, that's what I looked like back then when I was trying to do my incarnational approach. And this was a debate on whether or not we really two topics, whether or not we should use polemics with Muslims, or on whether or not we should employ historical criticism. So that was in 1997. We had this debate for 2 hours. I said, yes, we should use polemics, and yes, we should use historical criticism. Dr. David Marshall, who got his doctorate there at Cambridge University on the Quran, said no to both of them. Now, at the end of the debate, we asked for a show of hands as to who stood with him, who stood with me. 25 went with him, and 25 went with me. Who do you think went with him? The academics all went with him, and all the missionaries came with me. Now, I couldn't understand that. And on the way home, Dr. Peter Riddell, who you can see there at the bottom, who then became later my mentor for, and also my I did my work under him for my PhD. He explained it on the car going back to London. He said, Jay, the reason why academics can't go with you is because this material is so damaging and it's so confrontational and so controversial, that there is no way that we could use this in an academic environment, especially in Britain and in Europe, because there are many Muslims on staff with us, and this would cause so much infighting within the academy. Therefore, no academic will use this material. But you, as a missionary on the ground, out in the streets, not representing any institution or representing any chair to protect, you don't have a chair to protect. You can use it. You have the freedoms to do so. Please, for heaven's sakes, continue to do so. And it was so good for Dr. Riddell to explain that to me. And that's where the penny dropped back in 1997. And that's why I haven't stopped since 1997. I've been using this ever since. Why exactly the historical critique? Here is its value. Number one, it confronts the very foundations of Islam. You're going to see that today. We're going to confront the book, the man, and the place. I've added the place as well. The book would be the Quran, the man would be Muhammad, and the place, Mecca. And I'm going to confront their historicity. I'm going to confront their existence. Just that phrase right there, to suggest that Muhammad did not exist, to suggest that that Mecca did not exist, and to suggest that the book, the Quran, did not exist in the 7th century, is highly controversial and highly confrontational. So you can understand why academics don't want to touch this. Interestingly, it's neutral. Anybody can use what I'm going to teach today. All of you can use it. It's also politically correct. This is not hate speech. This has nothing to do with Islamophobia. It doesn't attack Muslims, because I'm not going to say anything against Muslims. It is not seen as hate speech. It is not Islamophobic at all. I'm not getting any strikes on my YouTube site for putting up this material. It is easy to communicate. You're going to see everything I'm going to show you. That's why I'm using a PowerPoint. I'm doing it also so I don't go off on tangents, but also it is easy. It is because it's so visual. And we have by far the best and the only antidote and the only answer and the only alternative to what I'm going to introduce today. So bear with me. Let's go ahead and let's really delve into 4 areas. The first area would be the sources. Then I'm going to go to the problem with Mecca. I'm going to then hit the problem with Muhammad, and I'm going to end with the problem of the Quran. I'm using that, leaving that to the very end because that's the most damaging. So what do the Muslims claim concerning their standard Islamic narrative? Well, they would claim that for the last 1400 years, Muhammad was the last and the greatest prophet, born in Mecca in 570, died in Medina in 632. Therefore, he is the model of Islam. He is the paradigm for all the Muslim world because he is the one that received the final revelation. That revelation is the Quran, sent down between 610 and 632 to Muhammad. It is the greatest and only perfectly preserved and final revelation of all revelations, and it corrects all that had gone before, especially the Old and the New Testament. Therefore, Islam is that final religion based on Muhammad's life and also on the Quran's teaching. That's what they would say. The conclusion? Thus, Islam is completely dependent on 3 things: the book, the man, and the place. The book being the Quran, the man being Muhammad, and the place being Mecca. Since these 3 are foundational to Islam, we need to investigate them. At the time they all existed, that's the early 7th century, in the place they existed, that's the Hijaz. That would be the central part of Western Arabia. And that's why, to do that, we need to start with the sources. We need to see where it all came from. Where is everything we know about this man, this book, this place? Where did it all come from? Well, we need to start with those sources. To do that, before we even get started, let's look at a map. Let's look at a map. When you look at the map of that part of the world, now, this is what Muslims tell us. This is not what I'm saying. This is the standard Islamic narrative that we're talking about. What Muslims say, according to their narrative, is that Muhammad's empire included that brown area there. Can you see the brown area there? That's it. Up till 632, that's all that he controlled or that Islam controlled. And there you can see Mecca and Medina right in the middle. Then, after he died in 632, you have Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and Ali, and they then expanded the borders to the Orange area. So from 632 up until 661, when Muawiyah brought in the Umayyad Caliphate, which would be the first Islamic caliphate, there from in 661, they had from 632 to 661, that Orange area was the area that they controlled. That's a big area. Are you seeing that? It goes all the way from Tripoli in the west, all the way to Afghanistan in the east, and from Turkey in the north, all the way down to Yemen in the south. Basically, the second biggest empire of its day at that time. And then after 661, after the time of the rightly guided caliphs, Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and Ali, then Muawiyah comes in and he creates the Umayyad dynasty. And then the Umayyad dynasty, which continues all the way up until 750, when the Abbasids take over, they then expanded the borders to the purple area. So from Andalusia, which is Spain today, including North Africa, all the way over to Afghanistan, up to Samarkand, and much of what existed before. I'm not interested too much in the purple area today, okay? Don't worry about the purple area. Just what we're going to deal with is the orange and the brown area. That's the material that we want to look at. So let's look at just that area. And to begin that, we need to look at their timeline. So here's the first timeline of many timelines I'm going to give you. Muhammad was born this is their timeline, not mine, okay? Remember, this is their timeline. Muhammad was born in 570. He started receiving the Quran in 610. He then went on a mirage up to the 7 heavens from getting back on the wing horse to go up to Jerusalem and going 7 heavens up to visit Allah and coming back with 5 prayers in 621. He then moved from Mecca up to Medina in 622, and then came back and controlled Mecca by 630, and then died in 632. Now, I'm just giving you the bare bones. This is just a skeletal quick look at Muhammad's life. He was then taken over by Abu Bakr, who then only lasted for 2 years, from 632 to 634. They're in Medina. They're ruling from that place. He died normally. When he died, Umar takes over, and he expands the borders more so than anybody else for the next 10 years. He is killed in 644. Uthman takes over, and he continues up until 656 for 12 years, and then he is killed in 656. But in 652, the Quran was compiled. The book that I have in my hand right here, the book that you're all reading, this book, they claim, was compiled by him in 652. You notice that's about 20 years after Muhammad first compiled it, or Abu Bakr first compiled it in 632. So once he is killed in 656, then Ali takes over. He only lasts for 5 years before he is killed at the Battle of Siffin by Muawiyah, and that's the end of the Rashidun period, the golden age of Islam. Note the conclusion. Therefore, Islam was fully formed in the Hijaz by 661 AD. That's what the Muslims are telling us. That's their timeline, not my timeline. However, how do we know all of the above? Where does it come from? Where does everything that I've just told you? Now, I've not told you on everything. I've just given you a bare skeleton. You know an awful lot more than what I've told you. Nonetheless, everything that you know about Islam, how it began, who Muhammad was, what the Quran's all about, where he lived, what he did, what he did with his wives, all those stories about Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and Ali, those great the Rashidun period stories. Where does it all come from? You'd like to know, right? And you would hope that it came from people who were actually living at that time, who were witness to these events, who heard what this man said, Muhammad said, or saw what he did. You would hope, right? So let's put up another timeline. To understand where that all came from, you need to go back to the standard Islamic narrative again. They will tell you. And what they'll say is Muhammad dies in 632. How do we know that? Because of his biography. The Sirah to Rasulullah, the biography of Muhammad. Who wrote it down? They will say it was written down by this guy here, Ibn Ishaq. Look at his dates, 765. Muhammad dies in 632. Are you starting to see a problem here, folks? That's 130 years later. Did this guy know Muhammad? No, he didn't. Did he live in the same century? Possibly he was born, but was he writing it down? No, he wasn't. But we don't even know anything about Ibn Ishaq. There is not a thing we know about Ibn Ishaq. His book that I have in my hand right here, but it's called The Life of Muhammad, a translation of Ibn Ishaq Siratu Rasulullah, written by Alfred Gill. I'm just going to stop sharing so you can all see it. Do you see it right here? This is the book you have to read. This is the book everybody has to read. Anybody that goes and does any course on Islam and Muhammad's life, you have to read this book. The Life of Muhammad, the translation of Ibn Ishaq Siratu Rasulullah. Notice the name, Ibn Ishaq. There it is, written by Alfred Guillaume. He translated it, okay? So that's the book you all know. That's the book you all have to read. You assume it's by Ibn Ishaq, right? That's what you assume. It's nothing to do with Ibn Ishaq. How do we know that? Because we don't have one word from Ibn Ishaq. What if you read the introduction to that book, you will see it comes from this man here, Ibn Hisham. And look at his dates. He dies in 833. That's 200 years after Muhammad. And we don't have, and he says clearly that he took what he liked of Ibn Ishaq and threw away the rest and only wrote what he wanted to. So let's just, if that is the case, then obviously he and Al-Waqidi, who comes right after him and writes about the campaigns of Muhammad, they are the only ones that we could go to find out about the biography of Muhammad. If they are the ones that actually write it down, let's get rid of Ibn Ishaq. Goodbye, Ibn Ishaq, because he doesn't have anything to do with us today. But that's not the only genre. We have much more about Muhammad from the Hadith. That's the sayings of Muhammad. Now, who wrote the Hadith down? Well, the first one to write it down is a guy named Al-Bukhari. Look at his dates, 870. And then we have Hadith by Sahih Muslim, 875, At-Tirmidhi, 844, Ibn Majah, 887, Abu Dawud, 899, An-Nisa, 915. Goodness sakes, that's 6 different hadith that were put together all in the 9th and 10th century. Not one of them was in the same century Muhammad was living. That's 240 years and later, 240 years after Muhammad. And then there are 2 more genres I want to introduce, and that's the tafsir, which are the commentaries on the Quran, and the tarikh, which would be the histories of all mankind. First, written down by Al-Tabari. Now, there are many that come after him, like Baidawi, Zamakhshari, Suyuti, but it is Al-Tabari that writes the first down. Look at his dates. His is 923. Folks, that's the 10th century. So where do we get the name Muhammad anyways to begin with? All of the story about him, who he was and what he said, comes from 200 to 300 years too late. I want to bring up this guy right here, Abdul Malik. Abdul Malik, in 692, is actually the first one that actually introduces who this person is. And he writes it on the Dome of the Rock. He puts it on coins and he puts it on protocols in 692. Well, hold on a minute. That's the late 7th century. Did he know Muhammad? No, he didn't. But I want to put him up there because we're going to talk about him later on, because he is the first one that introduces the word or the title or the name Muhammad. Hold on. You're going to see why that's important. But the people that actually introduced the man Muhammad, the one who is the prophet who comes from Mecca and Medina, the man who received the Quran, and the man who started this religion called Islam, are the Abbasids. They are the first ones to introduce this as a religious, in contradistinction to Christianity. So I'm going to put them there, but look at their dates. They don't even come into power to 749. That, folks, is a good 120 years after Muhammad's death, if he even existed. Can you see why we have to bring this up? You need to look at the sources. So, conclusion, Muhammad was revealed 84 years after the Abbasids created him, 141 years after he was first introduced, yet 201 years after he supposedly lived. These are all too late. I hope you're getting what I'm talking about. Let's continue on. It's not just that they're too late. Look and see where the authors were living. Now, what Muslims will tell you is that everything we know about Islam comes from these two cities, Mecca and Medina. That's the Hijaz. That's the central part of Arabia. That is where these men all lived. No, they didn't. All of these men were writing in Baghdad. Look where Baghdad is. That's 1,200 miles to the north. Ibn Hisham, who wrote the Sirah, was born in Basra, grew up in Cairo, but did all his writing in Baghdad. Cairo is 900 miles away. Basra is 1,200 miles away. So is Baghdad, 1,200 miles away. As far as al-Bukhari, who writes all the sayings about Muhammad, he comes from Bukhara, which is in Uzbekistan. That is 2,600 miles away. Al-Tabari, who wrote the Tafsir and the Tariq, he is from Tabaristan, what is today northern Iran, and that's 1,700 miles away. None of these traditional writers lived or worked in Mecca or Medina. They were too far to the north of Mecca and came from west and east of Baghdad, and they were writing hundreds of years after the fact. Can you see a problem, folks? Are you starting to get the picture? All of these northern areas are where the Abbasids originated from. These are all Abbasid writers. This is an Abbasid creation. This man, this book, and this place are all Abbasids. So you might say we have the same problem in Christianity. We have also got our tafsir and the tahriq and the sirah and yes, the hadith. Yes, we do. We have the exact same genre in the New Testament. The hadith of Jesus would be Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. That would be the red letter of their writings, the gospel accounts. The sirah of Jesus, the biography of Jesus, would be Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, his story for the last 3 years of his life, especially. The tafsir, which would be the commentaries about what Jesus said, that would be Paul's letters to the different churches and also to Rome. And then, of course, the tahriq would be the history with the book of Acts. So we've got the same genre, and we must have the same problems. And I hear this from Muslims all the time. Let's do a comparison. Now, I'm going to use dates that are going to step on many of your toes. Forgive me. These are very liberal dates that I'm using purposely just to make my point. So the first genre that we have of the Christian traditions would be the tahriq, would be the book of Acts, written by Luke between 52 and 62 AD. That would be within 20 to 30 years of Christ's death. Then you have the tafsir, which would be Paul's letters. He was killed in 65 AD. He was starting to write by 48 AD. So within 15 to 34 years, he's writing the tafsir of Jesus, that he applies what Jesus said into those different cities. And then we get the first sirah and the first hadith, written by Mark in 70 AD. That's 37 years after Christ's death. Matthew and Luke come after that, 80 AD. Folks, don't get angry with me with these dates. I'm giving you the liberal dates, okay? I know some of you are probably fascinated. These are not the right dates. Yes, these are not the right dates, but these are the most liberal dates. So that's why I'm making a point here. That's within 47 years of Christ's death. And then the last would be the Gospel of John, written around 90 AD, within 57 years of Christ's death. Now notice, all of this tahriq, tafsir, sirah, and hadith of Jesus were written within 60 years of Christ's death. What's more, all of these New Testament writers lived in the same place Jesus lived. And they either knew him personally, that's certainly the case with Matthew and John, or they got the material from others who did know him personally, who saw what he did and heard what he said. That would be Luke and Mark. So can you see when you do a comparison of these two, everything we know about Christianity comes within 15 to 60 years after Christ's death. Everything we know about Islam comes from 200 to 300 years, hundreds of miles away. Can you see which would be a more authoritative? I would suggest, as a comparison, if we had to depend on sources for Jesus comparable to what Muslims are dependent on for Muhammad, Jesus would not begin to appear until the 3rd century. How would we defend him? Now, remember I just put up that book and I showed you the life of Muhammad and I said, this is the book you all have to watch and this is the book you have to read about Muhammad's life. I said that came from Ibn Ishaq. Well, hold on a minute. We've just found out some new material. Alfred Guillaume did not get it from Ibn Ishaq. He did not get it from Ibn Hisham either. So who actually wrote that book? When was that book compiled? And who was the one that compiled that book? We don't have anything from Ibn Hisham from the 9th century, not a word from the 9th century. I was not aware of this over a year ago. This is all brand new material. So where did that book come from and where did Alfred Guillaume get his material? He got it from this gentleman, Heinrich Ferdinand Wustenfeld, who between 1858 and 1860 decided to compile this life of Muhammad. And so he went around to 4 different German cities. He was there in Germany, went to 4 different universities and different libraries, and started pulling all the Arabic stories he could find. He was an Arabist on this man named Muhammad, put together in a book and published it in 1860, and then translated it. That was translated by Guillaume then into English. Folks, what that means is that the man who Muslims are dependent on to know who their prophet is or what he did is an elderly German linguist who wrote Muhammad's story just 160 years ago, thus over 1,000 years too late. Can you then understand why the scholars are really in consternation? And what they're concluding is, this is what they're saying, not me, this is what they're saying. Islam, as we know it, did not exist in the 7th century, but evolved over a period of 200 to 300 years. The Quran probably was not revealed to one man in 22 years, but likely evolved over a period of 50 to 100 years. Therefore, their conclusion, the history of Islam, at least from the time of the Caliph Abdul Malik, 685 to 705 and before, is a later fabrication. Can you then understand their concern? Why they say did it take so long to write it down? Did these people, could they not read and write? Listen, they controlled Basra, Baghdad, Damascus, Jerusalem, Cairo by 642. Certainly someone in those cities could read and write. And then from Spain to India, they controlled all that by 685 at the time of Abdul Malik's reign. Could no one know how to read and write in any of those cities? Of course they could. So where did the 9th and 10th traditional writers get their material from? And should we be trusting it if it's 200 to 300 years later? Should we go back to the 7th century? Should we go back to that time period? Why don't we do that? Let's do that now.